We're going to show you today how to install the Hamilton Motor Company Apple CarPlay upgrade kit into a 2014 to 2019 4Runner. We're going to begin here by removing these two trim pieces on either side of the factory screen. When you remove them, you want to make sure all the clips stay with the piece, and then you can set them aside in a safe place. We'll remove the one on this side as well. Once again, we're going to confirm all the clips are there and set it aside. With the trim pieces removed, the next step is going to be to remove the factory climate controls. You can grip it around the knobs and simply rock it to one side and then the other. It will pop loose, and as you can see, there's a connector. You can leave that in place and just let it hang down. We are now ready to begin the process of removing the factory head unit. The next step is going to be to remove the 4 bolts securing the factory head unit in place. We're going to use a small ratchet with a little extension and a 10mm socket, and we're going to loosen and remove all 4 of these bolts. Once again, set them in a safe place that you won't lose them. This head unit is also held in by clips, so don't worry about anything falling once you have these bolts fully removed. With the 4 bolts under the factory head unit removed, it's time to remove the factory head unit. We're going to cover the gear shift with an old towel or sweatshirt, and that way when we lower the screen, we won't risk scratching it. Grip under the head unit firmly with one hand and on top with the other, and simply apply pressure to the head unit from each side and rock it loose. The head unit will then drop down. We can now begin the process of removing the original wires. With the factory head unit removed, it is now time to unplug all the wires. If you feel inclined, you can take a picture of the wires so you remember their orientation. That being said, the wires only fit in one way, so you won't risk being in a position where you don't know where things go if you put this factory head unit back in. So in this case, we'll simply start removing the wires. If this is the first time you've ever disconnected your factory head unit, sometimes the wires can be a little bit tricky to remove. They might be a little bit stuck over time, but generally speaking, if you apply a little bit of pressure with both hands, you'll be able to get the wires out without an issue. We are almost ready to separate the factory head unit from the vehicle. First, we just need to remove this one piece of tape holding the original wiring harness to the factory head unit. This tape will simply unthread from the factory unit. And you can leave that bracket on the factory unit. From there, verify everything is removed and set the factory head unit aside. We're going to be installing this box in place of this lower box on the factory head unit. This looks like a fairly intimidating installation, but it's much easier than it appears. To begin, we're going to use a knife and cut these few pieces of electrical tape so that we can separate this harness from the factory head unit. There's one little clip that you'll use a flathead screwdriver or a credit card and pop it up, and then you can slide this harness off of the factory head unit. From there, we'll come around here and set it aside. Remove all of these Phillips head screws using a small Phillips head screwdriver. If this is the first time your radio has ever been worked on, they may be in there a little bit tight, but if you just use a little bit of pressure, you'll be able to get them. The Toyota head units are very well made and the components are very high quality, so it's very hard to damage anything at all. With that bracket removed, you can simply set it aside. It will have the hazard light switch still attached to it, and then we will proceed to the right side of the vehicle and we'll do the same thing. In total, there will be 5 screws on the right side and 5 screws on the left side. With both of the brackets removed, this box will separate from the factory radio. You can set this box aside. Our next step is going to be to separate this component from the factory radio. We're going to use that Phillips head screwdriver again, and we're going to remove 2 screws on either side of these mounting points. It's nice if you'll keep these screws separated with the components. However, even if you do mix them up, they're all very similar and you won't hurt anything. We're going to repeat that process on the back side here. In the next 2 screws that we will remove, under these silver pieces of tape on either side of the control box, there will be 2 screws, one on either side, hidden under the tape. We'll simply use a knife to cut that tape. Then we can reach down there with the Phillips head screwdriver and remove the screw. This tape is not necessary, and you will not need to put it back. Now, all the screws are removed, and it's time to separate the metal components from the plastic enclosure. There's going to be 4 tabs, 2 on either side, and 2 on the top of this component. And we're simply going to pull these back. It's sometimes easier to reach down in there with a credit card and pop them loose the first time, especially for the ones on top of the unit. But basically, you'll start applying back pressure and popping them loose one by one. And we will show you a close-up of where these 4 clips are. Now that we have the metal enclosure separated from the plastic housing, it's very easy to see where those 4 clips were. One is here, one is here, one is here, and one is here. So as you can tell, if you have a little difficulty reaching into these top ones, you can simply take a credit card and reach down in and use that to pop the clips up. So we'll apply the back pressure and then loosen these clips one by one. It looks quite intimidating, all the electronics here, but we're only really going to take care of one easy step. Reach in with your fingernail and lift up on the black bars on each of these ribbon clips. These look very sensitive, but once again, they're pretty strong and you're not going to hurt anything most likely. With those removed, you can simply slide the ribbon clips out of the housing. And just like that, we have entirely separated the metal enclosure from the plastic. We will set this aside for now. We are almost finished installing the interface kit into the original head unit. We only have a couple more steps. Now we're going to use the small Phillips head screwdriver. We're going to remove 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 small Phillips head screws. Try to keep these in a safe place. Once again, you can separate them all from the rest of the screws so you remember which screws go where. But if you happen to drop or lose any of the screws, really don't sweat it. Toyota way overbuilds their components and they have more screws than are needed. So if you wind up with one missing, you're absolutely not going to hurt anything and you will never notice it once it is reinstalled. We'll set the 6 primary screws aside and we will remove this one last screw. This little clip, we'll leave it in place. Just like that, we've separated the enclosure bracket from the factory head unit. With the factory head unit completely separated from the mounting bracket and the factory plastic enclosure, it is now time for us to attach this Hamilton Motor Company interface to the factory head unit. Set the factory head unit down on a bench with these 4 foam standoffs pointing towards the air. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the interface where the wiring connectors are lining up with the factory wiring connectors and the backs are flush. Then we will take a large piece of packing tape or duct tape and we'll connect the factory head unit to the new interface. Ultimately, these brackets will hold it in place when we reinstall it into the factory mounting bracket and into the vehicle, but for the purposes of wiring it up, it's best to tape it so it doesn't move around. Now we have these 4 ribbon connectors here. The 4 ribbon connectors are going to be how we connect the interface into the factory head unit. With ribbon connectors, the blue side always points away from the circuit board. So use your fingernail and lift up the plastic bar on the 2 ribbon connector ports here and line up these ribbon connectors into their respective ports. And then close that plastic bar. As you can see on a ribbon connector, it has these 2 notches. Those notches will notch into the port on the circuit board. That's how you know you've got it in place. Once again, we'll do it with the smaller one here. Now we have the interface talking to the factory head unit. It's time to connect that to the factory screen. First, what we're going to do is reconnect the mounting bracket. The long belt cables will slot through the lower hole here, and we will put the factory mounting bracket back into place. Both the belt cables, the circuit boards, and the mounting brackets are much tougher than they look. You're not going to mess anything up by pulling on it, or if you have to connect it and disconnect it a couple times, that's totally okay. We have these 4 locator pins, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's how you'll know you have the factory mounting bracket back in its proper slot. From there, we will reinstall the 6 Phillips head screws that hold the factory mounting bracket in place. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we will reinstall the Phillips head screw holding on this tiny little bracket. With that complete, we have the belt cables exposed, the screws are reinstalled, and the mounting bracket is back connected to the factory head unit. We are now ready to connect the factory head unit and mounting bracket back into the factory screen and plastic enclosure. We have these 2 ribbon cables here. The longer one is going to connect into the longer port. The shorter one is going to connect into the shorter port. Ensure that both of these small plastic bars are lifted up, and then support the head unit with one hand. Then slot the secondary ribbon cable into place, ensuring that both notches are seated, and fold the bar down. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the way to know you have the ribbon cables properly installed is if this blue line is parallel with the cable connector. If the line is substantially farther back on one side, it means you've put the ribbon cable in at an angle, in which case you need to lift the top bar and redo it. With both ribbon cables connected, we will press the factory mounting bracket back into place. It'll fit like a puzzle piece, and you'll hear those 4 clips snap back in. We can now reconnect the Phillips head screws. We are now going to reinstall the Phillips head screws that hold the factory mounting bracket into the plastic enclosure. We are now going to reinstall the Phillips head screws that hold the factory mounting bracket into the plastic enclosure. The only ones that are a little bit tricky are the 2 down in the hole by the circuit board here. If you drop it into the hole, you're not going to damage the circuit board, but it will be a little bit tricky as you have to remove the clips so that you can pull the mounting bracket back off and remove the screw. Reinstall the mounting brackets. These plastic mounting brackets are each secured by 2 small screws. And we'll repeat this on the other side. We are now going to reinstall these mounting brackets on either side of the factory head unit. They're labeled EL and ER. That means EL for left, ER for right. Do keep in mind, this would be from the perspective of if you were sitting in the vehicle with the unit fully installed. I like leaving the tape in place until I have the mounting brackets on there to secure it. I'm going to use my screwdriver just to pop open these screw holes here. Now with these screw holes popped open, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the bracket. We will be using 5 of these small Phillips head screws. Some folks prefer to use a ratchet for these as they are bolt style screws. You can use either a Phillips head or a ratchet, whichever makes you feel most comfortable. Now, I said we are going to be reinstalling 5 screws. That's technically not true. We removed 5 screws, but the lower box had these big screw holes that the new smaller box does not have. So we will only be putting 3 of the 5 screws back. Now reinstall the 3 screws on the right side bracket. This one can be a little bit trickier as the hazard light wiring harness is partially in the way. So I like to get the screws started with my fingers. With the brackets reinstalled, go through and tighten every screw until the brackets do not move. You don't have to over tighten these screws, but they do need to be fairly tight. It is best not to fully tighten them until you have all 6 of them installed. Now we can remove the tape that you are using to hold the smaller unit into place. If you leave some tape behind the bracket, that's not a big deal. Now reconnect the factory hazard switch. If you want to, you can tape this small factory hazard adapter back into place. We typically don't worry about it. You will not need to mess with the dip switches. The unit is now completely ready to install back into the vehicle. It is time to begin preparing the vehicle to reinstall the factory head unit. We have this harness supplied with the Hamilton Motor Company Apple CarPlay upgrade interface, and this harness will clip into your factory vehicle harness. This connector with what we call the Easter wires, the pink, green, and blue, connects into this one here with the yellow, red, and brown, and it will leave this male. This one will go back into the factory head unit. This other T connector here has a variety of brown and pink connectors. This one will connect right here onto the factory connector with the striped and multicolored harnesses. So in conclusion, you will have 2 T's and this one new style connector. This will plug into the new factory interface. The next wiring harness included with the Hamilton Motor Company interface has a connector that will plug into the back of the interface and a USB port. This USB port will be for wired CarPlay or wired Android Auto. All of our kits come both with built-in wired and wireless CarPlay and Android Auto. These connectors are for some of our other products and will not be used in this case. This USB port, you have a couple options. You can feed it out down below here if you want it exposed. Alternatively, what most folks do is they feed it into the glove box where it pops out here. Some folks get very creative and they order adapters from Amazon that turn this into a mounted USB port, and they'll mount it somewhere here. So it's entirely up to you. What we typically recommend is just feeding it into the glove box. To feed the USB port into the glove box, you have a couple options. You can push from behind, pop out this access panel and drill a hole in it. If you're not worried about putting it back into place, you can simply leave the access panel removed. So you have a variety of options. For demonstration purposes here, we will leave the access panel removed. We will now feed the USB port into the glove box, and this will pop out back here. Now begin reconnecting the head unit. It doesn't matter in which order you start. You'll simply take all the connectors as they appear, and they will fit in like a jigsaw puzzle. The connectors will only go in one way. This harness previously connected the factory head unit to the lower box. It no longer serves a functional purpose with the lower box removed, but we will reconnect it and leave it in place in case you ever want to take the interface kit out. This is your hazard light connection here. And finally, we have the connections for the new device. Here's the first one. This will plug into the long slot. And the second one, which we connected to that USB port, will plug into a medium-sized slot. This small black connector will no longer be used. As well, this is the little accessory harness. These three connections that previously went to the smaller box will no longer be used. With the interface and the factory head unit plugged in, pick it up, tuck the wires back into the dash, line it up, and reconnect the factory head unit. At this point, what we recommend before you install any bolts is to repower the vehicle, turn it on, and test all of the features. We're going to test the steering wheel controls. We're going to test all of the buttons on the unit, the knobs. We're going to test the backup camera. We're going to test the audio. We have a separate video that shows you how to use the audio on this device and how to set up the Apple CarPlay. I highly recommend you watch that video now, as setting it up for the first time, if you're not familiar with it, can be just the slightest bit tricky. So go ahead and watch that video, pair your phone to the device, make sure Bluetooth, CarPlay, Android Auto, whatever your preference is fully working, and then come back to this and we'll show you how to button it up. With the factory head unit put back into place, we have tested all the functions, including the backup camera, the steering wheel controls, the audio. We're going to go ahead and reinstall the 4 bolts. With the 4 bolts reinstalled, we will take the factory climate controls and press them back into place. The final step is to take the 2 vertical trim panels and press them back into place. With both trim panels reinstalled, your installation process is complete, and you can now use your head unit with factory-style Apple CarPlay.